Thank you for the opportunity to share in the teachings and to participate, at least in this way, in the retreat. I do enjoy my yearly visit to Grass Valley. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there this year in person. But I'm happy to see that you're carrying on that valuable tradition there. So I offer my pranams to Swami Sita and my other fellow Swamis there and all the Sangha. I'll start by sharing a quote from Rabindranath Tagore that I ran across recently. The quote goes something like this: I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and saw that life is service. I acted, and behold, service is joy. I appreciate that quote and the way that it connects service with joy, and furthermore, to understand love as a natural outpouring. Love as service is simply the natural expression of love. We see from our yoga practices that we aren't adding something, we aren't acquiring something through our practice. We're simply exposing this natural sense of peace that's within us, this natural sense of connection with the web of life. And because of that natural connection, this natural flow of love, it's not something that we have to create. There's a Hafiz poem that reminds me of this. It's fairly short. I think I know it well enough to be fairly accurate. The Hafiz poem reads this way: even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me. Look what happens with a love like that. It lights up the whole world. That's the beauty of the sun. The sun doesn't need to turn on the light or the heat. The sun doesn't decide not to give off light and heat at some moment. It's the nature of the sun to express itself, to express its qualities. In the same way, it's our nature, when we tune into it, when we touch that ground of being that we all share, where we are connected with each other, then love is a natural flow, a natural expression of that connection. Of course, the culture that we live in doesn't teach us this way. Because of the way that we're socialized as young people, the prevailing messages of the culture, we think of happiness, we think of love as things that we acquire, right? Things that we arrange for, things that we achieve by our efforts. And many people, no doubt, end up in a relentless effort to create an identity that is lovable, to attract and acquire the love of another person. And of course, there's a lot to be learned in loving relationships. But of course, normally in a relationship where one thinks of love as something you can acquire, as another element in the effort to achieve happiness, then the love is tainted with selfishness. My teacher, Swami Ramananda, used to say, then it becomes a business deal. I love you if you love me, right? A business arrangement. And if you no longer love me, then it's time for divorce. Fortunately, love, the effort to love, and our tendency to fall in love with another person teaches us a lot. We learn how to open our hearts wider and wider. Sometimes through pain. I would guess that almost everyone here has experienced what we often talk of as heartbreak. My heart was broken. At least one poet that I know and appreciate speaks about heartbreak as breaking open the armor around the heart. And she says in one line of the poem, then the heart can no longer think. It is beating only for itself. So it's often through heartbreak that we open our hearts wider, that we let go of our small-minded, ego-centered way of loving, and we allow the natural expression of love to take place. Love is not a static energy that sits inside of us. The nature of love is to flow. Many years ago, I still remember this, driving in a car, listening to a cassette audio tape. Some of you will remember those. Right? Your car had to have a audio cassette tape player. And I was listening to a tape player of Jack Kornfield speaking, and he was quoting a Buddhist teacher whose name I can't remember, but I remember the quote. This Buddhist teacher said something like this, and I'm paraphrasing. We are all made out of love. That was what really struck me right from the beginning. We are all made out of love. He went on to say, everything in nature is made out of love. And the third sentence was, and it's the nature of love to be expressed. So to think of love expressing, it's not something that we have to make an effort to do, to create, but rather to open up, to allow it to happen. Just like the nature of the faucet at the sink is for the water to flow out. We never think of bringing water into the faucet. It's the nature of the water to flow out from the faucet. In the same way, We experience love when we express it, rather than when we acquire it. It's something that's meant to flow outward. And of course, how will it flow outward? How will it express? A beautiful expression of love is service. We'll naturally want to serve those that we love, to take care of them, to think of their well-being. One of the teachings that we run across in the Yoga Sutras, very important and fundamental teaching, is that of vairagya, sometimes translated as non-attachment. And it can be easily misunderstood if we think that non-attachment or vairagya implies detaching ourselves from each other. Quite the opposite in a way. Vairagya implies a more complete, a more pure, a more unconditional love for another person. Because I'm seeking not so much to gain something from them, but to give fully. I can share a little anecdote that I'm reminded of when I think of this non-attached love. Of course, one of the most beautiful examples, expressions of love is the love of a mother for children. Even a mother who has enjoyed her freedom as a young person readily gives up so much of her freedom to devote her life to caring for her children. Makes many sacrifices for their well-being, even gives up sleep in order to feed the baby. With this anecdote, this little example comes from a friend of mine in New York when I was living there. She shared with me how her son was pressuring her. Her son had dropped out of the university, was living in an apartment, working a job to pay the rent. And he pressured her to give some of the money she had set aside for university, to give some of that money to help him pay the rent. He had fallen behind in paying the rent, and he was desperate. And he called his mother, wanting that money. And even though she pressured him, my friend, her name is Kali. She thought to herself, I shouldn't give that money. He might need it for the university still. So even though he wanted that money and he got angry at her when she refused to give it, he actually hung up the phone on her. She still felt like, no, my love isn't something that I'm dependent on. I'm not dependent on his love. My love is to think of his well-being. We should keep that money for the university. And the reason I remember the story is because later the son was grateful that the money was still there when he did go back to school and was able to use it for the university time. So love as service doesn't necessarily mean pampering someone or giving them everything they want, but it means really thinking of their well-being. It means not depending on them to give something back. I think there are plenty of popular songs that speak about love as a one-way street. That's a good way to think of it. Not a business deal, but something that we give readily without wanting something in return. And in this sense, love as service is not something that we may easily experience, since we do need to overcome the conditioning that's ingrained in us from our culture. So we could say that it is something natural, but we may have to practice it to learn from experience the joy of serving that Tagore referred to. Right? I acted, and behold, joy is service, or service is joy. Right? It's when we give love, when we serve others, that we align ourselves with the natural flow. We align ourselves with the higher will. That's where our lives really take on meaning. We feel ourselves to be part of a much bigger picture instead of isolated and alone. The sense of separation is one of the root causes of suffering. Yoga helps us understand. And this natural expression of love happens anytime that we get beyond that small-minded thinking. I want to read a few words from a doctor, a medical doctor and psychologist who served as a therapist for many cancer patients. She was a cancer patient herself. And she's written several books that I recommend. One of them called Kitchen Table Wisdom. It's Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. And in this article that was published many years ago, she's speaking about the difference between helping someone and serving them. The difference between fixing someone and serving them. And I want to read a few of her words because I think they're so helpful. Service rests on the basic premise that the nature of life is sacred. That life is a holy mystery which has an unknown purpose. When we serve, we know that we belong to life and to that purpose. Fundamentally, helping, fixing, and serving are ways of seeing life. When you help, you see life as weak. When you help someone, you help them from a position of strength. And you may see them as weaker than you, in need of your help. When you fix, you see life as broken. And she speaks about, in this article, about how so often a doctor sees the patient as broken, and the doctor thinks of him or herself as someone who can fix that brokenness. She goes on to say, when you serve, you see life as whole. From the perspective of service, we are all connected. All suffering is like my suffering, and all joy is like my joy. The impulse to serve emerges naturally and inevitably from this way of seeing. I loved reading that from a medical doctor. That distinction between helping someone from a position of being stronger than them. Sometimes even helping someone in that way diminishes their strength and their self-esteem. But when we serve, we are equally served. When we love, the service is something natural that comes to us, that comes through us. We see each other as whole, and we serve with our hearts, and we in turn are served. So service implies that rather than fixing or helping, that we see life as whole, that we see the light in each other rather than the brokenness, and that we are just as served as those that we serve. And that's the beauty of love. It never runs out. It's the one thing we can give away and never run out of. It's the one thing that never dies, even when the person that we love passes away. So let's look at some of the ways that we can practice love as service. That we can practice loving this way, unconditionally, letting love flow naturally from our hearts. So while it is natural for us, it's something that we may need to practice. Now, I want to speak about love as service in a few different ways. Some of us may feel this ability to love more fully. We may come to that feeling through devotion to a deity or a saint or a spiritual teacher, to some personification of the divine. That's easier to feel that kind of wholehearted love and devotion. And that can be a beautiful practice, the practice of devotion, that takes the form of offering what we do to God in some way. Mother Teresa was a beautiful example of this. She saw her God in the most needy, the unwanted, right? The marginalized populations. And her service to that population, to those who were unwanted and rejected by society, her service to them was an offering to God, was a service to God. So when we feel devotion to God, a beautiful expression of that devotion is to serve our fellow human beings. I'll read a brief quote from my teacher, Swami Ramananda, who said, "To get God's grace, means to get the grace of your neighbors. God doesn't need your worship and service directly. Worship the creation and you have worshiped God. Serve the creation and you have served God. I like that. If we really want to honor God, express our devotion to God, think of ourselves as an instrument of God in the world, that would be by serving each other, by taking care of our neighbors, by thinking of the well-being of those that we encounter throughout the day. Because are they not the expression, the spark, or the image of God? So it's a beautiful practice to choose to see the divine light in the people around us and to serve them. The life that Mother Teresa chose is certainly a very high form of love as service. We may not be ready for that right away, but a beautiful practice for all of us is to express love as service to those right around us. To know this is how we can be an instrument of God, as the prayer of St. Francis reads, let me be an instrument. So at least one form of expressing love as service is through devotion to God in some way. Karma Yoga also is another way that we can practice. There are infinite ways to practice love as service, to express our love by thinking of the well-being of others. I mentioned before, parenting a child is a beautiful expression of love. Where we let go of our personal desires and needs, we think of the well-being of others. It comes naturally. And hopefully it can be a way of a way of learning to love in this unconditional, wholehearted way. Another very simple, practical practice is to simply put love into everything that we do. So we don't have to wait for some special opportunity to be kind to a neighbor, right? To carry something that's heavy for someone. We can put love into cleaning our room. We can put love into cooking, loving energy into the food. And my teacher used to say that in the ashrams in India, the head of the kitchen should be one of the highest disciples of a master, one of the most evolved souls, because of the importance of preparing the food with loving energy, with a pure heart. It's a beautiful practice to chant mantra, to put loving energy into the food when we cook. And of course, into the way that we relate to each other, into our relationships. One teacher, I'm forgetting her name right now. I was reading a book of hers on the practice of forgiveness. I know Fred Luskin is going to speak about that later. But she advised one way to prepare ourselves for forgiveness is to simply look on our fellow human beings with compassion in our hearts. And she advised a practice called a compassion walk, where as you move around in the world, as you walk to the store, during your commute to work, as you encounter and see other people, to look at all of them with compassion, even though you may not interact with them, simply to think of their well-being, to wish them well. Another practice along these lines is the Buddhist practice of loving kindness meditation, where you systematically think of people that you do love and offer them loving kindness. You think of people that you don't know well and you offer them loving kindness. And then you even think of people with whom you struggle, with whom you have a difficult relationship, and you practice offering them loving kindness. So these are things that we can actually practice, cultivating this openness of heart, allowing this flow of love. And the beauty of practicing this is we do find that it's joyful, that it's meaningful, it's fulfilling. Right? The more that we allow love to flow through us in the form of some kind of service, the more joy we experience. So that alone becomes a source of motivation to practice this way. Even in one's job, even in some work that isn't especially uplifting, working in retail business, in marketing business, in the tech industry, in a business or corporate culture, it's possible to put love into what we do. It's possible simply by thinking of the well-being of everyone that we're involved with. Can I think of the well-being of the client? Can I think of the well-being of my coworkers? Even the well-being of my supervisor, my boss? It's a beautiful practice, one that easily opens the heart and lets that compassionate energy flow. Just to think of the well-being of others. And of course, along with that, to think of our own well-being as well. You can think of selfishness as me-centered, a me-centered way of thinking. And it's a thinking that's upside down. Because if we turn the M in the me upside down, we have we-centered thinking. Turn the M upside down, it's a W. We-centered. We-centered way of thinking means that we think of the well-being of everyone, including ourselves. And this is another way that we can practice serving, is to keep ourselves in good shape as well, so that we can serve well. My teacher used to say, even your eating and sleeping can be considered karma yoga. If you eat in order to serve well, if you sleep and you rest in order to serve others. That's a beautiful way to think of your self-care. Not to pamper yourself, not to go to extremes, to try to preserve the physical looks of the body, but to take care of the body and mind, to be mindful of our well-being, in order to be able to serve well. And that shifts our intention. That shifts our heart from selfishness to selflessness. When we think of taking care of ourselves so that we can serve well, being mindful about our diet and what we eat so that we can function in an optimal way. Being mindful about how we handle stressful situations in life so that we can function in an optimal way. So love as service can be boiled down to something very practical that we can practice every day. Every day we have an opportunity to be a little more thoughtful. I have an opportunity to speak with you all tomorrow, and I'll speak a little bit more about this. Every day, an opportunity to practice less harmful intentions and more loving intentions. The last way I'll speak about love as service, and this is something that we are practicing a lot at the Institute here in San Francisco recently, is to pray for the well-being of others. There are many times when we may not be able to physically serve someone or help them or relieve their suffering, but we can always pray. There's so many people suffering from the climate crisis, which has reached an emergency level. Flooding in one place in the world, fires and drought in another place. Certain places in our world becoming uninhabitable from climate change. The COVID virus, or coronavirus, as Swamini shared yesterday. She had me laughing again and again yesterday. The coronavirus, teaching us to open our hearts and have compassion for each other. It's created so much suffering, so much loss in our world. And one of at the very least, things that we can do about all of this, all of these world crises, is to pray for the well-being of others. So every morning, I'm sure you do this at the Sivananda ashram also. We chanted last night, Trayambakam mantra. Every morning we chant Trayambakam mantra, a mantra that offers healing and protective, loving and serviceful energy. We pray that mantra for the well-being of all those who are suffering. We keep a list here, a prayer list, and we invite our Sangha members to give us the names of anyone they want us to pray for. And we write their names in that list and we read those names. And we offer our prayers for their well-being. It's a beautiful practice that enables us to open our hearts to those who are suffering and to send loving energy, even when we can't serve them physically. So I think I want to encourage us to think of love as service as something that we can practice every day, that can bring us joy, that can gradually purify our hearts, that can unlock or open the door to this natural flow of love. You can see from my sharing that I love poetry. I want to read a poem that beautifully exemplifies this thinking. By a contemporary poet named Rosemary Traumer. She lives in Colorado, a Native American poet. I have to use the reading glasses. Here's the poem. Give me a heart that breaks, a heart that longs to open wider and wider, always revealing more space. Give me hands that long to serve. Make them strong enough to build what must be built. Make them fall in love with letting go. Make them unable to hurt. Give me a mind that leans toward generosity, a tongue that speaks in only we, feet that run toward those in need, eyes that see beneath the masks, ears that hear the silence that is the staff for every sound, a nose that follows the fragrance of truth, blood the same red as everyone else's. Give me a heart that breaks again and again, the way ocean waves break, unpredictable, an endless breaking, an endless release, in which nothing is ever really lost. That's the poem. I'll reread a couple of phrases. Give me hands that long to serve. Make them strong enough to build what must be built. Make them fall in love with letting go. Make them unable to hurt. To me, this is a beautiful prayer. It awakens this intention to allow our hearts to break open wider and wider, to allow this natural expression of love, like the sun, to shine its energy in the form of service. So that's my sharing. I hope my thoughts have been helpful. I hope it inspires all of us towards more service, to a life that's more fulfilling and more full of joy. Thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts. I look forward to the other events as a part of the retreat. Om Shanti. Om Shanti. Om Shanti.
Om Namah Shivaya, Swamiji.